Two very good recent depictions of Fred Rogers. The Netflix documentary, And Won't You Be My Neighbor? Really terrific, and lots of interviews, but especially with Fred Rogers' wife, who's also an incredible person. And then the Tom Hanks movie, which I hear is delightful. How many of you have seen that? That was out over just a few. We should all watch that together sometime. Fred Rogers did go to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, a Presbyterian institution, and his ministry was to launch this children's program. He never served a church. He wanted a children's program that was nonviolent and respected children. And by golly, the Presbytery of Pittsburgh ordained him to do that. And so I'm just wearing a sweater today to be like Fred Rogers. This is the second part of a two-part sermon series on Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. Our children in Sunday morning children's nurture are exploring the parable of the Good Samaritan all this month, so we're going to join them by taking a closer look at one of Jesus' most interesting and well-known stories. Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan in response to two questions by a lawyer who was an expert in the Jewish law. These are not sincere questions. These are not the questions of somebody who is sincerely seeking to hear what Jesus has to say. These questions are a test. They are meant to trip Jesus up, to get him to say something that would be damaging to his growing reputation. The lawyer asks, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus doesn't take the bait, however. He responds to this question with another question: what does the law say? What do you read there? And the lawyer gives precisely the right answer: love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Exactly right, Jesus says. Do this and you will live. But the lawyer doesn't receive Jesus' answer graciously. Luke tells us that the lawyer wants to justify himself, meaning he wants to prove that he is right and superior to Jesus. So snarkfully, the lawyer asks another question: and who is my neighbor? Jesus answers by telling a story. A man, a Jew presumably, is walking down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. This road, still there, and it's all downhill through ravines and valleys where robbers can hide and jump out onto the road and attack any wayfaring stranger. The man is attacked. He is mugged, beaten, stripped of everything he owns, including the clothes on his back, and he's left lying half dead in the ditch. He is robbed of his possessions, his health, his dignity, almost his life. I've been reading about the Felony Lane Gang in the newspaper. The Felony Lane Gang has been targeting moms across the country for years. What they do is snatch the purse or smash and grab a purse that's left inside of a car. And they've been doing this at shopping malls, funeral homes, fitness clubs, and churches. Anywhere where women are tempted to leave their purse in the car because they'll only be somewhere inside for a brief period of time. They snatch the purse, then using the IDs and credit cards in that purse, they start cashing bogus checks and going on shopping sprees, and it's happening in Metro Detroit. The Felony Lane gang has a group here. They are robbers. They're called the Felony Lane gang. The Felony Lane is the lane at the drive-through bank that's farthest away from the teller and the cameras and being visible. Robbers take what is not theirs and make it their own. Some are violent, like the Felony Lane gang. Other robbers, however, are not as violent as they are verbal, meaning they take something from you by what they say. There are people who try to justify themselves by being constantly negative and critical of others, but they are only like that when the person they're talking about is not in the room, not with them. And there are people who love to gossip. They try to prove their own superiority by passing along stories of other people's mistakes or misbehaviors or misfortunes, sometimes true, but sometimes not. Both these kind of people rob others of their capacity to respond. They rob others of their basic human dignity. Some robbers are violent, other robbers are verbal. Before long, a priest comes walking down the Jericho road. Priest is a religious professional. He knows the law. He looks and sees the man lying in the ditch, and he walks right on by. Pretty soon, a Levite appears, another religious professional, and he does the same thing. The priest and the Levite are indifferent to the man in the ditch. Before I got to Princeton Theological Seminary, some well-known psychologist ran a psych study on the campus of the seminary. What they did was give seminary students an assignment to preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And they were to preach it in the chapel. So it required the students to move from the classroom to the chapel. And they were going in small groups or one by one. That was part of the experiment. While they were moving from the classroom to the chapel to preach the sermon on the Good Samaritan, there was somebody laying on the sidewalk, obviously in need. But here's the thing, the students were late. They were running late to get to their assignment to preach in the chapel. What do you think they did when they encountered somebody laying on the sidewalk? Most of them stepped over in order to go preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to the parable of the Good Samaritan often. Dr. King provides an excellent explanation for why people do things like that. Why the priest and the Levite and some students at Princeton Seminary would just pass by someone obviously in need. In a sermon, Dr. King said, "I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me, and that is, these people are afraid." The first question they ask themselves is, if I stop and help, what will happen to me? People are on their way to an important meeting, and if they stop, maybe they are afraid they're going to be late. Or perhaps the man is dead. If they stop and help, this is for the priest and the Levite, and touch him, they are afraid they'll be considered unclean according to Jewish law. Or maybe they're just typical human beings, not bad people, just busy people, preoccupied, and they're afraid that it get involved with a messy situation and messy circumstances. I think Dr. King is right. I think people don't get involved because they are afraid. And when we're afraid, we only think of ourselves. That makes us indifferent. And then a Samaritan appears. Samaria is the area north of Judah and Jerusalem. It's part of the long gone kingdom of Israel. In Jesus' day, Samaria was a separate country. And Samaria has a religion that is similar to Orthodox Judaism in Judah and Jerusalem, but there's enough differences to make Jews and Samaritans hate one another. And it's that violent kind of hate, that toxic kind of hate that is fueled by tribalism and racism and religion, the kind of things that have been the dominant source of conflict in our world, like Protestants and Catholics for centuries in Northern Ireland, or Sunni and Shiite in the Middle East, or Israeli Jews and Palestinian Muslims. And I'm fearful that now liberals and conservatives are approaching that kind of level of animosity here in the United States. The Samaritan on the Jericho road is held in contempt by the citizens of the country in which he is traveling. Nonetheless, it's the Samaritan who stops. If there is any moral or physical danger involved, the Samaritan ignores them. If there are any ancient hostilities between people, the Samaritan disregards them. If there are any gaps in understanding between the Samaritan and the person who's laying there about religion or about politics or anything that would cause them to begin to argue when the man in the ditch comes to, the Samaritan figures they'll just deal with that stuff later. It's the Samaritan who stops and kneels down beside the man lying in the ditch and tears pieces of his own clothes in order to bind up the wounds of the man in the ditch after cleansing them with oil. And then he hoists the man up onto his donkey, and the Samaritan takes him to an inn, checks him in, pays the bill, and assures the innkeeper that he will return when the man has recuperated and pay whatever the balance is. Which of these three, Jesus asked the lawyer, was the neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? There's only one answer, and the lawyer gives it. The neighbor is the man who showed mercy, compassion, and kindness. Go and do likewise, Jesus tells him. It's important to see exactly what transpired in this conversation between Jesus and the lawyer. The lawyer asks an abstract, theoretical question. And who is my neighbor? He's really asking, who is not my neighbor? Who do I not need to pay attention to? How far does my compassion go? Does it go to someone who doesn't believe like I do? Does it go to someone who is a different race than me? Does it go to someone I don't like? Does it go to someone I despise? How far do I have to go? Jesus doesn't really answer that question. Instead, Jesus tells a story that dramatically says, your neighbor is someone who needs what you have to give. A neighbor is anyone who's lying in the ditch by the side of the road. A neighbor is someone who needs your help, even if you have good reason to despise them. A neighbor could be your spouse or your child or your partner or your friend or a colleague at work, but your neighbor is especially total stranger who you don't know, who looks different than you, who has a different religion than you, who has different politics than you, who may be supporting a candidate you don't like. And when you encounter a neighbor in need, the question is not, if I stop and help, what will happen to me? The question is, if I don't stop to help, what will happen to this person? Jesus' answer to the lawyer's question is not theoretical. It is not abstract. It is as simple and as practical as can be. Your neighbor is the person right in front of you who needs what you have to give. Your love, your attention, your kindness, your discretion, your goodwill, your help. This is Van Gogh's painting of the Good Samaritan. And the way that he did this suggests to me one more thing to say about the parable. It says that Jesus is the Good Samaritan. God's love is extravagant and unconditional and practical. Jesus comes to us with God's love wherever we are, lying in a ditch, sitting at a desk, lying in bed in an assisted living center, anxiously waiting for the doctor to call, waiting in line at an ATM, or even sitting in a church pew. Jesus is the Good Samaritan who comes to us with God's love. And what he does is the same thing the Good Samaritan did. He binds up our wounds. And then he lifts us up just as the Good Samaritan lifted the man in the ditch onto his donkey so that we can continue the journey. Jesus is our Good Samaritan. And he comes to us with God's love to make us good Samaritans too.